My name is Mark Mach, and I'm going to be talking about Cuba today in my final presentation draft. That's my case study nation. And I'm going to be using Loom to film it, and then I'm going to upload it to YouTube. So, in the beginning, I'm going to talk about kind of like the history of Cuba, kind of like its early history, how Columbus took over the country in 1492, imposed rule over the native population, and then also many Africans came to Cuba and they were forced as slaves and they worked on sugar plantations. And that accounted for that the Columbus imposing Spanish rule and the Africans coming over. That brought some more ethnic diversity to the country, as shown by this graph. And then I'm going to kind of talk about the timeline of power. After that, in 1898, the Spanish-American War gave Cuba independence from Spain, and that was made final in the Treaty of Paris. But finally, in 1902, Cuba became an independent country because they were under U.S. military rule before that. Cuba had a lot of corrupt rulers. Fidel Castro in 1958. Then he kind of passed the torch to his brother Raul Castro, and then he passed the torch he picked Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez in 2018, and he is currently the president of Cuba. Then I'm going to kind of talk about the kind of like the physical characteristics of Cuba. So it's an island country between the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean Sea. It's the largest in the Caribbean. We have the population of 11 million, an area of 110,000 square miles. It's similar to the size of the state of Pennsylvania, which I think is a cool way to kind of like show like something people understand, because many people know how big Pennsylvania is. The typical climate, I'm going to talk about that. How is a rainy season, a dry season? It's very flat, but there are some hills in the southeast. There's large population clusters, particularly in cities, especially Havana, which has 2 million people. And then my theme for the presentation, to kind of tie my case studies together, is I'm going to talk about the economic difficulties and how that made many Cubans want to emigrate. So the Cuban economy used socialist economic measures to gain political control over the citizens. But in 2011, they did have a Cuban Communist Party Congress to talk about loosening these restrictions, and they have done very well at doing that. Well, not very well, but they have made improvements, but a lot more needs to be done. Then I'm going to talk about my first case study. So Cuba was very dependent on the Soviet Union for money and resources. They actually paid off about 90% of their $35 billion debt, so they really were providing. They also depended on them for their agricultural sector. So they provided everything from crops to like the machinery to the gasoline for the machinery. But in 1991, the USSR fell, and Cuba really suffered because of that. They lost not only like a lot of money from them, but also they lost their agriculture. Like their people were starving. So something cool I was going to talk about here, it was from my first case study. It's urban agriculture. So the people of Cuba kind of like overcame this, and they used their cities, because Cuba is actually 77.2% urban, like their people. So they used the like landscape of their cities. They used rooftops, like windowsills, like outside the buildings, and they used urban agriculture. And now they compare in food production to countries such as the United Kingdom, but the only thing there, the only difference between them is that Cuba's is all organic. They don't use artificial stuff, so it's really good. So they've really been thriving in the food-wise because of that. Then I'm going to talk about the U.S. embargo, how Cuba traditionally, it started in 1958, and they like use that to kind of like say this is why a lot of our problems happen. John F. Kennedy was the president during this. Then I did a case study about this. So I'm going to talk about the U.S. did it under Kennedy because they were against Castro's regime, and they were not going to support a country that was under Castro. And so pretty much the U.S. gave them an ultimatum. You trade with us or you trade with Cuba. They told us to the other countries. And so, obviously, the other countries chose the United States because they have such a big economy, and they'd be able to like profit more and like get more out of trade relations with the United States and with Cuba. So this caused Cuba to go into over $144 billion in debt. And also, they had a shortage in necessary supplies and materials like medical drugs. So that was very bad. And then I'm going to explain this comic and how it's like it's the United States, like kind of like Uncle Sam like hugging Cuba, like this boat can't get in. This boat represents like the other countries that want to trade with Cuba, but they can't. And pretty much like the other countries like want the embargo to stop, but the U.S. will not. Then after that, I'm gonna do an interview with these two girls on my floor, and I'm gonna ask them about their parents used to live in Cuba, so I'm gonna ask them about what it was like when there were economic problems, like what their parents have told them about what life was like, to kind of get like that perspective of what it's like to live in Cuba. And the embargo is still yet to be lifted, so that is it's crazy to me. So then a lot of people emigrated from Cuba. Their net migration rate is literally negative 3.7 migrants out of 1,000 populations, so more people are leaving than coming. And then this is a meme I had in my case study. Cubans migrating anywhere else, and then Cubans migrating to Florida, especially urban areas, because a lot of Cubans come to Florida because it's so close, and they go to urban areas. This is a picture of Little Havana in Miami. Because like many Cubans went to Miami. It's a city in South Florida, very close, very convenient. Like I said, it's literally 90 minutes from the Keys. Here's the southernmost tip of Florida in the continental United States. From 1980 to the present, the population of Cubans in the U.S. has more than doubled, and there's been a wet foot, dry foot policy for a while. It actually recently just ended in 2017, but it said if Cubans get caught by the government, like the U.S. or Cuban, like migrating while they're still in the water, that they'll have wet feet, so they're sent back to Cuba. But if they make it to U.S. land, they can't be sent back to Cuba. So now they have to go through the legal immigration process. And then at the end, I'm going to say Cuba's gone through a lot of struggles. They had economic hardships, political corruption. Even though there have been improvements, such as the termination of the Castro administration, there's still a lot to go for this country. For example, there's the San Isidro movement ongoing currently. I heard from one of my friends. She's Cuban, and in 2019, the Cuban government actually made harsher censorship laws on the country, which I find insane. So they do not have freedom of speech. And although Cuba's far away from continental Latin America, which I have in this map, it still shares a lot of struggles. For example, Venezuela and Cuba both have economic issues. Black Lives Matter showed how we really are a global community. And this course, it really helped me become more of a global citizen. I have a deeper understanding of countries that aren't just the United States. Like, I know more about places where I don't live. And I find that really cool. I love learning about other cultures and all that. And a question that I want to ask at the end is, like, how do you think Cuba's economy will hold up with a pandemic? Because that has affected everyone in so many ways. In Cuba, already having a weakened economy before the pandemic, thinking about how it will be affected, it could really harm the country, and I'm sure it already has. So that's my presentation. I forgot to cite these sources, but these are like all my sources from my case studies, and these are the new ones. And so I'm just gonna do that, but I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I'm really excited about it. I worked really hard, and I'm super excited for you to see the final product. All right, stay safe and go Gators.